The long-term implications of these 7 major changes extend far beyond the immediate administrative adjustments that pensioners must navigate in 2026. These reforms fundamentally reshape the social contract between the Philippine government and its aging citizens, establishing new expectations about individual responsibility, technological competency, and the balance between benefit generosity and fiscal sustainability. Understanding these broader implications helps contextualize the specific changes and prepares both current and future retirees for an evolving retirement security landscape. The emphasis on digital systems and technological solutions throughout these reforms reflects a broader governmental push toward e-governance and automated service delivery. While efficiency gains and cost savings motivate this digital transformation, the approach assumes a level of technological access and literacy that significant portions of the elderly population simply do not possess. This creates a fundamental tension between modernization objectives and inclusive service delivery that ensures no vulnerable citizen is left behind due to digital divides. Financial literacy emerges as an increasingly critical skill for pensioners managing their benefits under the new system. The introduction of tiered calculations, automatic adjustments with conditions, revised loan programs, and integrated multi-system records requires beneficiaries to understand complex financial concepts and make informed decisions about retirement timing, loan utilization, and benefit optimization. Many elderly Filipinos lack this financial sophistication, having worked in informal sectors or rural occupations where such knowledge was never necessary. The absence of widespread financial education programs for seniors represents a significant gap in the reform implementation strategy. The quarterly certification requirement fundamentally alters the relationship between pensioners and the institutions serving them. Previously, retirees could largely forget about SSS or GSIS after completing initial retirement processing, passively receiving monthly deposits without ongoing institutional engagement. The new regime demands continuous interaction, regular compliance demonstrations, and sustained attention to institutional communications. This transformation from passive recipient to active participant places particular burdens on the cognitively impaired, the very frail, and those suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's disease, who may struggle to manage recurring obligations. Healthcare considerations intersect significantly with these pension reforms because elderly populations experience disproportionate health challenges that can interfere with compliance. A senior hospitalized for stroke may miss certification deadlines through no fault of their own. Those with severe arthritis may find biometric scanners unable to read their deteriorated fingerprints. Vision impairment makes navigating digital interfaces nearly impossible without assistance. The reforms include provisions for medical exemptions and alternative verification methods, but awareness of these accommodations remains limited, and accessing them often requires advocacy that vulnerable seniors cannot provide for themselves. The survivor benefit modifications reflect evolving social attitudes about family structures and gender roles, while attempting to provide more realistic support for diverse household situations. Recognizing that remarriage does not necessarily eliminate financial need, particularly for elderly widows with limited earning potential, represents important progress. Similarly, extending educational benefits through graduate school acknowledges modern educational requirements for economic advancement. However, the introduction of means testing for these expanded benefits creates administrative complexity and potential for inequitable outcomes based on documentation availability rather than actual need. The unified database integrating SSS and GSIS records addresses a long-standing frustration for workers who moved between sectors during their careers. Teachers who spent early careers in private schools before transferring to public systems, military personnel who later worked civilian government jobs, and countless others who navigated between private and public employment previously faced challenges maximizing their combined benefits. The integrated system promises fairer treatment that recognizes total working careers regardless of sectoral movements. However, data quality issues and the technical challenges of merging decades of records from separate systems could result in errors that disadvantage individuals whose employment histories are complex or poorly documented. The automatic inflation adjustments represent perhaps the most significant policy victory for pensioner welfare, potentially ending decades of pension stagnation followed by occasional legislated increases that never fully compensated for accumulated inflation. Tying benefits to objective price indices removes politics from adjustment decisions and creates predictable annual increases that help retirees plan their finances with greater confidence. However, the escape clauses that allow suspending adjustments during fiscal stress could undermine these benefits if invoked frequently. The actual impact will depend on SSS and GSIS investment performance and whether administrators exercise their discretion to suspend increases conservatively or routinely. Intergenerational equity considerations permeate debates about these pension reforms. Current retirees naturally focus on maintaining and enhancing their own benefits, having contributed throughout their working lives with the expectation of specific retirement support. However, younger workers who fund current pensions through their contributions increasingly question whether the systems will remain solvent when their own retirements arrive in coming decades. Balancing the legitimate needs and expectations of current beneficiaries against the equally legitimate concerns of future retirees requires difficult trade-offs that satisfy neither group completely. The loan program restrictions illuminate tensions between paternalistic protection and individual autonomy. Preventing over-indebted seniors from borrowing additional amounts protects them from reducing their net income below subsistence levels. However, it also removes agency from elderly adults to make their own financial decisions, even if those decisions carry risks. Some pensioners may rationally choose to borrow despite leaving themselves little current income, perhaps to invest in income-generating activities or to address urgent family needs they prioritize above their own consumption. Determining the appropriate balance between protection and autonomy in pension policy remains philosophically complex with no clearly correct answer. The private sector has responded to these pension reforms with both opportunities and concerns. Financial service providers see potential in developing products targeted at pensioners navigating the new system, including insurance products, investment vehicles, and financial planning services. Technology companies market smartphones, applications, and training programs to help seniors meet digital requirements. However, businesses also worry about the economic impact if pension reforms reduce elderly spending power or create benefit disruptions that decrease household consumption. The elderly population represents significant consumer demand for healthcare, retail, and services that depends on stable and adequate pension income. Civil society organizations working with elderly populations face increased demands as they help members understand and comply with new requirements. These groups conduct information sessions, provide application assistance, accompany seniors to appointments, and advocate with institutions on behalf of individuals facing problems. The volunteer capacity of these organizations is being stretched thin by the complexity and compressed timeline of the reforms. Many groups lack resources for the sustained engagement required to effectively support their members through this transition, highlighting the need for government funding or partnerships that build civil society capacity to serve elderly populations. The media landscape surrounding pension reforms has been characterized by both helpful information provision and sensationalized coverage that sometimes misleads more than informs. Responsible journalism that explains complex policy changes in accessible language while fact-checking rumors serves crucial public education functions. However, clickbait headlines promising dramatic benefit increases or warning of imminent suspensions without proper context create confusion and anxiety. Social media amplifies both accurate information and dangerous misinformation, making media literacy essential for seniors trying to understand what actually affects them versus what represents speculation or deliberate falsehood. Religious institutions play important roles in many Filipino communities as trusted information sources and support networks for elderly congregants. Churches, mosques, temples, and other faith communities can serve as effective channels for disseminating accurate information about pension reforms and organizing assistance for seniors struggling with new requirements. Faith-based social service organizations often have established relationships with vulnerable elderly populations and could extend institutional outreach if properly engaged as partners. The spiritual and social support provided by religious communities also helps seniors cope with the stress and uncertainty that major policy changes inevitably create. Academic researchers and policy analysts continue studying these reforms to assess their effectiveness, identify unintended consequences, and recommend adjustments based on implementation experiences. Universities, think tanks, and research institutes conduct surveys, analyze administrative data, and model long-term fiscal impacts. This evidence base should inform ongoing refinements to the reforms and future policy development. However, the quality and relevance of research depend on access to data from SSS and GSIS, which has historically been limited. Greater transparency and data sharing with qualified researchers would enhance evidence-based policymaking. International development organizations, including the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and various United Nations agencies, monitor Philippine pension reforms as part of their broader engagement on social protection and aging issues. These institutions provide technical assistance, policy advice, and sometimes financial support for Social Security system strengthening. Their experiences across multiple countries offer valuable comparative perspectives on what works and what pitfalls to avoid. However, international recommendations must be carefully adapted to Philippine contexts rather than mechanically applied based on experiences in countries with very different economic, political, and cultural circumstances. The informal sector workforce presents particular challenges for pension system coverage and reform implementation. Millions of Filipinos work as vendors, drivers, farmers, fishers, domestic workers, and in countless other occupations outside formal employer-employee relationships. These workers rarely contribute to SSS and therefore accumulate little or no retirement benefits despite lifetimes of productive labor. While the reforms primarily affect current pensioners, they also have implications for extending coverage to informal workers. The difficulty of collecting contributions from scattered self-employed workers and the financial constraints that make regular contributions unaffordable for low-income informal workers represent ongoing challenges that reforms have not adequately addressed. Gender dimensions of pension reform deserve greater attention, given that women comprise disproportionate shares of both elderly poverty and long-term care needs. Women live longer than men on average, meaning they spend more years in retirement, requiring more total benefit payments. Many elderly women never worked in formal employment covered by SSS or GSIS, instead performing unpaid domestic and care work throughout their lives. Widows dependent on survivor benefits face particular vulnerabilities when primary earners die. Gender-responsive pension policy would explicitly consider these realities and design reforms that address rather than exacerbate gender inequalities in old age security. Disability considerations intersect with pension reforms because many seniors experience disabilities that affect their ability to comply with new requirements. Visual impairments make digital interfaces difficult or impossible to use. Hearing loss complicates phone-based verification. Mobility limitations prevent travel to certification centers. Cognitive impairments interfere with understanding complex instructions. The reforms include provisions for reasonable accommodations, but whether these actually materialize in practice across thousands of barangays and municipalities remains uncertain. Disability rights advocates emphasize that accessibility cannot be an afterthought, but must be designed into policies and systems from inception. The economic context in which these reforms occur significantly influences their impact on pensioner welfare. During periods of strong economic growth with low unemployment and rising wages, pension reforms that constrain benefits somewhat may cause less hardship because family support networks have greater capacity. However, if reforms coincide with economic downturns, high unemployment, or inflation spikes, the combination of reduced benefits and deteriorating economic conditions could push vulnerable seniors into desperate poverty. The 2026 implementation occurs against a backdrop of ongoing economic recovery and moderate inflation, but future economic shocks could dramatically alter the reform's welfare impacts. Climate change and environmental degradation pose emerging threats to elderly populations that pension systems must increasingly consider. Senior citizens are especially vulnerable to extreme heat, typhoons, flooding, and other climate impacts. Disaster displacement can separate elderly individuals from support networks and make compliance with pension requirements impossible when documentation is lost or access to verification facilities is disrupted. Climate-resilient social protection systems would incorporate disaster response mechanisms that automatically extend deadlines, provide emergency benefit advances, and relax verification requirements during and after calamities. The question of whether these reforms ultimately strengthen or weaken retirement security for Filipino seniors cannot be definitively answered based on policy design alone. Implementation quality will prove decisive. Well-intentioned reforms that are poorly executed can cause more harm than maintaining flawed but familiar existing systems. The coming months and years will reveal whether SSS and GSIS can successfully implement these ambitious changes while maintaining benefit continuity for millions of vulnerable pensioners. Early indicators suggest significant implementation challenges that require urgent attention and course correction to prevent widespread benefit disruptions. For individual pensioners, the immediate priority is understanding exactly what they must do to maintain their benefits without interruption. This means registering on digital platforms or arranging for family assistance to do so, marking calendars for quarterly certification deadlines, ensuring contact information with institutions remains current, and staying informed about ongoing developments through official channels rather than rumors. Proactive engagement with these requirements, while burdensome, offers the best protection against inadvertent benefit loss during this turbulent transition period. The 7 major changes introduced in 2026 will be remembered as either a necessary modernization that secured pension systems for future generations, or as a misguided reform that created unnecessary hardship for vulnerable elderly citizens. Which narrative ultimately prevails depends on choices that administrators, policymakers, and civil society make in the coming months about how to implement these changes with maximum support for affected seniors and minimum disruption to the vital benefits on which millions of Filipino families depend for their daily survival and dignity in old age.